Radar systems in War Thunder can be enormously complicated. I'm going to show you the keybinds, go over the interface, and explain the advanced features. All of it. Before I start, a shameless plug to drop a like and a sub if you find this guide useful. Plus, the channel has a ton of playlists you might like. Anyway, there are caveats to a lot of what I'm presenting here. Some radar sets have quirky modes that don't function exactly like normal, some radar sets filter out ground clutter better or worse, so on and so on. I'm going to teach you all the basic concepts here to get you up and running, but you may still have to practice a bit and learn your individual radar set. Now before we get any further, I want to go over some keybinds. There are a lot of them, and operating radar in War Thunder uses more keybinds than any other function in the game. But the good news is, you don't need all of them all of the time. I'm going to give you the important ones now, and I'll be going over the related keybinds in each section of this guide as well. At a minimum, you want to set Switch Radar IRST Search on-off, Change Radar IRST Mode, Radar IRST Beyond Within Visual Range Combat, Change Radar IRST Search Mode, Change Radar IRST Scope Scale, Select Radar IRST Target to Lock, Lock Radar IRST Target. So to start off, let's take a look at reading a radar stat card. You can see the stat card on your plane's radar by going into the hangar, selecting the X-ray view, and hovering the mouse over it. You can also do this on your pilot to check out your plane's ballistics computer, which has some related features we'll talk about later. First on the stat card is the model of radar. Second is the type of radar. This is generally going to say either search radar, radar, or radar/IRST if the set includes an infrared search and track unit. The majority of radar sets are just going to say radar. Next is the radar band. This is a longer topic, but the simplest explanation is that the higher the alphabet letter radar band, the higher frequency the radar set operates on, and the more accurately it's going to track targets. The vast majority of radar sets in War Thunder use the I band, and the only practical difference in-game is that radar contacts show up as more narrow lines on the scope, getting closer to being just a dot on the higher band radar sets. Next is the radar's range. This is its maximum range under ideal conditions, and it doesn't mean you can detect any and all targets out to that distance at any altitude. Next is the search zone, measured in degrees. Some radars can change this, which we'll go over in a few minutes. Finally, you have an itemized list of any advanced features the radar has. I have a section covering most of these individually, but there are two that are reasonably simple and don't need any longer explanations. IFF, which is Identify Friend or Foe. This prevents you from locking on friendly radar targets, but just know that it's not foolproof. And BVR, which is Beyond Visual Range Mode. This allows you to set your scope distance out to very long ranges and usually adjust your sweep angles. The rest of these features are going to be getting their own sections, but something else to mention here. If your radar includes any advanced look-down modes, like Pulse Doppler or MTI modes, the stat card will indicate Look Down All Aspect or Look Down Head-On. If the radar has regular search mode, in addition to the Look Down modes, the regular search mode will be itemized as Look Up. Now let's look at the radar scopes and make some sense out of the displays. War Thunder has three different types of radar displays. While other types of radar scopes exist, such as the A scope, the J scope, and so on, they aren't present in the game, so I'm not going to get into them. First is the PPI, the Plan Position Indicator. This is the familiar slice of pie radar scope, and it visualizes a top-down view of the radar picture in front of the aircraft relative to the nose of the aircraft. This is the default radar scope in War Thunder. Next up is the B scope. This is also a top-down view of the radar picture, but it distorts the info a little bit to fit into a square, kind of like a globe of the Earth gets morphed a little for presenting it as a flat map. If you want to use the B-scope, you have to turn it on kind of deep in your settings. You gotta go into Preferences, Air Battle Settings, and then toggle Use Rectangular Radar Indicator, which is defaulted to being off. The third is the C-scope. This represents a first-person view looking out in front of the aircraft from the point of view of the radar dish. In the game, a few early radar sets provide this in addition to the PPI or the B-scope, and it's also used for infrared search and track systems. Radar contacts are indicated with a dot, and the current scanning direction is also indicated with a slightly different dot. Okay, let's talk about how to read a radar display and make sense of all these numbers and stuff. This info is presented in slightly different locations on the different radar scopes. The line that's moving left to right shows where your radar beam is searching, and the dots, or lines, represent things that your radar actually sees, usually called radar contacts. Your radar contacts will show up a little bit differently depending on if it's a general contact, if it's selected, if it's a locked contact, or if it's a friendly contact. A selected contact will get two vertical lines as brackets on the side. Sometimes it can be hard to see that if your scope is cluttered with too many contacts. A locked target will show up as a dot. More advanced radar sets will also show you a little line coming out of the dot, showing you the direction that the locked target is moving, which can be extremely helpful. A friendly contact will show up with a line over it. Keep in mind that IFF is not perfect, depends on multiple factors to work correctly, and sometimes your radar will misidentify or still let you lock up a friendly contact. The icon with the 4 bars indicates the amount of interference from ground clutter that your radar is currently experiencing. The green smearing effect on your scope is the actual radar clutter. These numbers on the side indicate the current vertical elevation of your radar dish. These numbers indicate the current scan angle in degrees. You can cycle through your radar's available presets, if it has any, with the Change Radar IRST Search Mode keybind. This number shows the current range scale on your scope. You can cycle through your radar's available presets, if it has any, with the Change Radar IRST Scope Scale keybind. Your radar mode will be shown here. You can cycle through radar modes with Change Radar IRST Mode. Each radar mode has its own abbreviation, and sometimes multiple sets of letters will appear showing you that, for example, your radar is in Moving Target Indication Search Mode, or that it's tracking a target in Pulse Doppler mode. Here's a quick list of all of the current radar modes. I'll leave this on the screen for a moment, and I'll be going over most of these in detail individually. Another thing to be aware of is that your current radar beam direction is indicated by green lines that move out in front of your plane in the external view. You'll see one up at the top moving left to right, and one on the right side moving up and down. These indicate the current location and direction of your radar beam, and it can help visualize the search pattern your radar dish uses. If you change the scanning azimuth of your radar, you'll see these changes, and it can help visualize a bit clearer what part of the sky your radar is actually looking at in search mode. Some radar sets support a setting that allows you to control your radar elevation relative to the horizon instead of your plane. If you want, you can go into your options and air battle settings and disable constant elevation of radar antenna. Your radar will align itself to the horizon instead of the direction your plane's nose is facing. There are limits, of course, once you point too far up or down, and not all radar sets support this feature, but it can still be situationally useful, and some players swear by this. Some radar sets also have functionality for you to manually adjust the horizontal and vertical search areas, in effect letting you manually aim your radar dish. To adjust the horizontal search area, you need to set your keybinds for Horizontal Radar IRST Target Q Control Axis. These will allow you to manually control the azimuth of your horizontal search area, assuming that your radar supports that function. You literally just swing it left to right. To adjust the vertical search area, things are a little more involved. First, you have to turn off the constant elevation of radar antenna feature, which is the one we looked at a moment ago that makes your radar search area follow the horizon. Once that is off, you can manually adjust the search area vertically using your keybinds for Radar IRST Tilt Control Axis, which will move your search area up and down. These features work for radar and IRST, but they're only available on more advanced aircraft. Unfortunately, these features are not itemized or labeled in any way on the stat card, so you just have to try your plane out to see if it works. So let's look at a few special types of radar. First up, we have radar gunsights, identified in the game as radar rangefinders. There are always a lot of questions about these, as for most players, they don't seem to actually do anything. These radar sets are permanently in acquisition and tracking mode. On most of these, you'll notice the indicated mode is ACQ, acquiring target. When something flies in front of you within the radar's zone of detection, ACQ will change to TRK, indicating that it's tracking a target. This is going to show up as a dot or a line on your radar scope. You don't get any additional information about the target. The primary purpose of this is just to get an accurate range measurement. And since you can already see that in arcade or realistic battles, this isn't giving you any additional information that you didn't already have in those game modes. In simulator battles, tracking a target with the radar gunsight will update your cockpit's gyroscopic gunsight, but in arcade or realistic battles, really doesn't do much for you. However, you might find it useful flying close air support over a ground battle where the air target tracking UI is disabled. Notably, tracking with a radar gunsight counts as a radar lock for the purposes of slaving an infrared missile, which I'll get into later when I talk about radar locks. Also noteworthy is that a small number of more modern aircraft with radar gunsights can change the range setting on the scope, though there really isn't much reason to do so. Next up are early dipole search radars. These are fixed radar sets found on some World War II era aircraft, and instead of having a radar dish, they use a fixed set of antennas projecting a constant field of radar energy out in front of the plane. These are search only, have very low frequency bands, don't detect targets very well, have a fixed radar scope, and are highly susceptible to ground clutter. For best results, you really want to be above around 4,000 meters in altitude with these radar sets. Radar contacts are displayed as a wide horizontal line on the display, which is much more difficult to read on the B-scope, by the way. Given the poor range and accuracy, these radar sets have limited utility, but they can still be situationally useful flying above a ground battle and in simulator mode. Next up are search-only radar sets. There aren't very many of these in the game, so if you have one and you're wondering why you can't lock up a target, it's not you, it's the radar. Just like with the dipole sets, the radar is locked into SRC search mode. Unlike the dipole sets, you get the search beam displayed on the scope, along with the azimuth indications out in front of you in the third-person view. Radar contacts will be displayed as a blip on your scope, and keep in mind that the width of the blip is again determined by the operating band of the radar set, with higher bands giving a narrower blip, letting you determine the target's direction a bit more accurately. Notably, some of the early search-only radar sets also give you the C scope in addition to the PPI or B scope. Next, let's look at a more conventional modern radar set that can search and track targets, commonly known as locking on. The radar has a search mode, just like the ones that we've looked at before, but it can also lock onto a target. You do this by hitting your keybind for Lock Radar IRST on Target, go figure, which will put your radar into acquiring target mode, ACQ. You'll also get some blinking brackets out in front of you on the screen. This is going to show where your radar is pointing to try and acquire a target. This is called a radar targeting frame. On most radar sets, this will aim your radar beam directly at the target you have selected, and I'll go over target selection in a minute, to try to get a radar lock on that target. If it can't lock, ACQ will change back to SRC, and it'll go back in a regular search mode. If it does get a lock, ACQ will change into TRK, and the target will change to a small circle or dot on your radar scope. Now, please remember that locking a radar contact isn't foolproof, and there are a lot of variables that impact whether or not you can actually lock something up. This is a much larger topic that I don't have the time to get into here in this video, but just please keep in mind that the target's speed, size, range, direction, altitude, use of chaff, and even its shape all make a difference, in addition to factors like ground clutter. Lastly, some radars are just better than others at locking targets. As a special note, some radar sets are able to achieve an initial lock on a target in a small targeting zone in front of the radar dish. On radar sets with this limitation, part of your radar scope will be shaded slightly, which indicates that the target has to be in that area in order for you to lock onto it. So just keep that in mind if you see the shaded area on your radar scope. Some radars have a feature called ACM mode, which stands for Air Combat Maneuvering, and it's an itemized feature on the radar set. This allows you to toggle your acquisition mode to stay on, instead of just trying for a second or two. When you do this, your radar dish will generally ignore target selection and just point directly forward, trying to lock the first thing that it can find out in front of the radar set within the radar frame. You toggle this on or off with your keybind for radar IRST beyond within visual range combat, which is kind of a counterintuitive keybind. More advanced radar systems will support multiple radar frame aspect ratios, and you can cycle through them with your Change Radar IRST Search Mode keybind. While in acquisition or tracking mode, your radar scope will not be searching and you won't get updates on your scope. A small number of planes actually have two small radar sets in them, so they can keep searching while locked onto a target, but these are uncommon, and it's not the same as track while scan, which we'll be going over in a minute. So let's talk about how to select a radar contact for tracking. If there's only one thing in front of you, this is pretty easy since it's going to be selected by default, and you'll see those two vertical lines on the scope showing that your one radar contact is selected. If you have multiple contacts, there are two ways to select between them. The first is the default method, known as cyclic targeting. Hit your keybind for Select Radar IRST Target to Lock, which will cycle through available contacts and select the next one available. You can tell which contact is selected by the vertical lines forming a little bracket around it. When you try to lock on a radar contact with your Lock Radar IRST on Target keybind, as opposed to the ACM Boresight mode we talked about, it'll try to lock the one that you have selected, regardless of which radar contact is closest. The second option is to use manual radar queuing, which is a bit more advanced and kind of cumbersome. You have to enable this deep in your options menu under Air Battle Settings. If you want to use manual queuing, uncheck Target Cyclic Switching of Aircraft Radar. After that's turned off, you can manually move the targeting brackets on your radar scope using some additional keybinds. You'll need to set horizontal and vertical radar IRST target queue control axis keybinds. Once this is done, you literally just move the brackets around on the scope with your keybinds, and when you try to lock a target, it'll go for the one that's closest to being inside the bracket. In the heat of combat, this can be pretty difficult, and I generally don't recommend this method of target selection unless you've got a fairly elaborate control setup. Unfortunately, there isn't a keybind to switch between these methods, so you have to toggle it on or off in the Options menu. Once you actually have a target locked, a few things happen. You're going to get a solid green square out around the target, and your radar will stay in TRK tracking mode, ignoring other radar contacts to focus on only your locked target. You'll also get some additional information about your locked target. You'll get a very accurate distance measurement near the top right of the square, and a relative speed indication on the bottom right. A positive number means that you're getting closer to the target at that speed, while a negative number means that they're pulling away from you. On most radar sets, you also get a target movement indicator below the frame. It's a little green circle with a line showing the target's direction of movement. If your radar is advanced enough, you'll also get this on your radar scope. Your locked target will show up as a little circle with a line in it showing the direction of travel. Also, when you have a target locked, some radar sets will give you a weapon range indicator on your scope. This shows an estimate of the range of your currently selected missile based on the distance, speed, and direction of your target. The minimum and maximum ranges are displayed as horizontal arch lines on the PPI scope or as flat horizontal bars on the right side of the B scope, with the narrow lines showing the ranges and the wider line showing where your locked target is. But just keep in mind, these are estimates and can change dramatically if the target pulls hard, speeds up, or whatever. Another thing to keep in mind is the selected range scale on your scope. If you have, for example, a 60-kilometer range on your scope, but your selected missile only has a 5-kilometer range against your locked target, the range indications on the scope are going to be tiny and really hard to see. So if your radar can change scope ranges, it's often pretty useful to set it as low as you can in a dogfight for specifically this reason. Now, speaking of weapons, some advanced infrared missiles allow you to slave the seeker head to a radar lock. This doesn't make the missile any more accurate, and it only helps targeting before you fire. The idea is that the weapon's targeting reticle will automatically snap to your radar lock, allowing you to get a weapons lock faster, and sometimes it can help you achieve or maintain a weapon lock against a target that's dropping flares. Maintaining the radar lock after firing the infrared missile doesn't give the missile any additional benefits. Next up, let's look at some advanced look-down radar modes. The first one is MTI, which stands for Moving Target Indication. On planes that have this, it's itemized on the radar stat card as look-down all aspect, the same as Pulse Doppler look-down mode, and once you're flying, you can change into this with your Change Radar IRST mode keybind just like normal. This will change your radar scope to MTI mode. This radar mode is essentially going to be better at tracking targets at low altitude than regular radar, and when you're in MTI, you'll notice that the scope is completely clear of ground clutter regardless of your altitude. Now, the way this actually works is by storing the radar signal in a buffer for a fraction of a second, and then comparing it to the signal that comes in a fraction of a second later, and then filtering out anything that doesn't change. This means that the ground, which doesn't change, is filtered out, leaving only moving targets in the air. Ingenious, but it has a weakness. If a target is moving away from the radar at close to the speed that the radar is moving forward, it will look to the buffer like the target isn't moving at all, and it'll get filtered out with the ground clutter. Whoops. Now, if you're having problems with locking a target with MTI mode in a tail chase, or at especially close ranges, this is probably why, so try just switching back to regular lookup search mode. The next is basic look down mode, indicated on the scope as LD. This is not Doppler radar, and it provides basic look down functionality using a signal processing technique called analog envelope detection to try and compensate for ground clutter. Now, it doesn't filter out the ground clutter completely, and you'll still see some on your radar scope, but the LD mode tries to just deal with it more effectively using some electronic signal processing. As of making this video, only the MiG-23 family's Sapphire radar sets have this, and they'll automatically switch between MTI or LD based on your altitude, with LD being used higher up. The LD mode is more accurate at longer ranges than MTI mode, hence the switch once the ground is further away. Next up is Pulse Doppler mode. This is marked on the scope as PD and itemized as Look Down All Aspect on the stat card. The easiest way to explain this one is that it detects the target's movement relative to its surroundings, rather than detecting the target directly. In this context, it detects the velocity of an aircraft in contrast to the zero velocity of the ground behind it, and you'll notice that most Pulse Doppler radars have basically zero ground clutter on the scope. However, there's a weakness. A target that's moving side to side relative to the radar will look like it has zero velocity, since it's not getting any closer to or further away from the radar set relative to the ground behind it. Exploiting this intentionally is a technique called Doppler notching, and it's a common tactic used to break radar locks against Pulse Doppler radar sets. If you have Pulse Doppler on and a target in the distance seems to just suddenly vanish, it's probably because they turned too far sideways. Try going back to look up search mode instead. Now, some Pulse Doppler sets also support Pulse Doppler velocity mode, indicated by PDV on the radar scope. This is basically the same as regular Pulse Doppler mode, except that it displays the velocity of the target rather than the distance of the target on your radar scope. You can see in the clip here that this target is moving towards me at supersonic speed, but it still appears farther away on the scope even when we're right on top of each other, because the scope is visualizing the target's speed rather than its distance. Next up is Track While Scan mode. This is itemized on the stat card as TWS, and it's displayed on the radar scope as well. This mode is going to allow you to select a target for active radar missile launch while still scanning, or just to get some additional info about a target without locking it up. In short, you kind of get half of a radar lock on your target. Now, the selected target is going to get a bracket around it that's the same size as the radar lock square indicator, but with some little gaps in it. You can cycle through targets using your normal methods, and this can actually be a pretty useful feature to visualize what you have selected before you try to go for a regular radar lock, since it's showing you your selected target out in front of you in addition to having it shown on the radar scope. Selecting, but not locking, a target with Track While Scan allows you to designate a target for active radar missile launch, and also supports radar slaving for advanced infrared missiles. However, you cannot fire or guide a semi-active radar missile using Track While Scan. Next up is Head-On mode, itemized on the stat card as Look Down Head-On, and displayed on the scope as HDN. This is a Pulse Doppler radar mode that is optimized towards detecting targets that are flying towards you, and it can detect and track incoming targets at a further range and more accurately than regular Pulse Doppler mode. However, it has less range against targets flying away from you, and some radars in Head-On mode have a dead zone where they can't detect anything at all. For example, this Yak 141 in HDN mode has a dead zone displayed here on the radar scope. You can't see or lock anything in that area with the radar unless you switch modes. The good news is, at longer ranges, the HDN mode not only detects targets further away, but it maintains the radar lock more easily. Next up is Ground Targeting mode, indicated by GTM on the scope, but not yet itemized on the radar stat card as of making this video. I have confirmation from the devs that this mode is being actively worked on, and it may get itemized and/or expanded onto a lot more aircraft in the coming months. GTM mode allows you to target moving targets on the ground, and it ignores contacts in the air or stationary targets on the ground. Ground targeting mode can be compatible with ACM Boresight targeting and even track while scan mode, and all the controls for those are exactly the same as any other radar mode, except that it's scanning for moving contacts on the ground instead of things in the air. A special note that this radar mode is kinda cumbersome to use with track while scan if you're trying to guide in an air-to-ground weapon, and targets are going to vanish if they stop moving, so this might end up being more useful in searching for things to target with other methods rather than using GTM mode itself as a primary means of locking a target. Similar to GTM mode are anti-shipping radars. Currently, as of making this video, anti-shipping radars don't have any letters displayed on the scope to identify anti-shipping mode, nor do they have anything itemized on the stat card to indicate that they only detect naval targets. This feature may get itemized in the future and is being actively worked on at this time. Anti-shipping radar generally works the same as GTM mode radar, except that it's searching for and targeting boats instead of moving targets on the ground. This radar mode does not suffer the limitations of GTM, and it can detect stationary boats in addition to moving ones. You operate the controls exactly the same as for a normal radar. Next, we're going to talk about helmet-mounted targeting. This is itemized as HMD on the ballistics computer rather than on the radar, but it's directly related to radar, so we're covering it here. If your plane has helmet-mounted targeting, you can use it to slave the seeker of an infrared missile before launch for easier targeting, which will happen automatically when you adjust your camera view. And it can be used to aim your radar at a particular point as a means of target selection when going for a lock. You do this with your keybind for beyond within visual range combat, just like you were going into ACM Boresight mode, and then you hit it a second time to cycle into the helmet-mounted sight. The targeting frame will turn into 4 little dots, and it'll aim your radar wherever your camera is pointing. Once you have a target inside the dots, you can use your keybind to lock radar IRST target to achieve a conventional radar lock. You do not need to keep the camera pointed at the target to maintain the radar lock, only to initially select the target when trying for a lock. Next up is the EEGS, or Enhanced Envelope Gunsight, which is also itemized on the stat card of your ballistics computer rather than the radar set. This is a feature on advanced jets that provides a target-adjusted point of impact indicator for your aircraft's guns. In short, if you have a radar lock on a target, your gun sight changes once you get within gun range, and it shows you where your shots will fly relative to your radar-locked target. This is an impact indicator, not a lead indicator, and you need to maneuver so that the gun sight is directly over the target and then fire. It's not perfectly accurate, but it's usually pretty close. Next is infrared search and track. This isn't actually radar, but it uses the same interface. If your plane has an IRST unit, you switch into it using your keybind for Switch Between Radar and IRST, which will change your radar display to the C scope and turn on infrared tracking, showing an IR on the scope. This system detects heat and is entirely passive. It doesn't set off radar warning receivers, doesn't suffer ground clutter, and it can't be notched. The catch is, it's comparatively short range, and it can't measure distance on its own. Locking a target with the IRST can be used for slaving an IR missile, but it cannot be used to guide a semi-active radar missile. Basic IRST units, like this one on the F-8E, don't give you any additional information with a target lock, since, again, the IRST can't measure distance and it can't compute direction or anything, so really, the main point in locking a target is just to have the square floating around it for visual tracking, or to slave an infrared missile if it supports that feature. More advanced IRST units, like this MiG-29, actually include a laser rangefinder in addition to the infrared search and track unit. When you lock a target, the IRST tells the laser where to point, which provides a very accurate distance measurement. These advanced IRST systems will change out of the C-scope when you get into Boresight targeting or when you have a target locked, and they can be used for EEGS calculations, but still can't guide a radar missile. The last major system we're going to look at is the radar warning receiver. This is that circular display on the left-hand side of the screen there. The radar warning receiver uses a series of sensors on different parts of the aircraft to detect incoming radar signals and warn you when you're being scanned by search radar or when you're being locked up. You're going to get little half-circle looking blips on that circular scope that indicate a radar ping, showing you that something in that direction has spotted you on search radar. If you get locked up, you'll get a dotted line pointing at the source that's locking you. The radar warning receiver does not measure distance or altitude, or, currently, the type of radar that's pinging you. Keep in mind that the indicated direction isn't perfect, and it's an estimation made by your plane's computer. Additionally, currently, radar warning receivers do not generally filter out friendly radar sources. So if a friendly player is scanning you or locks onto you, it's going to set off your radar warning receiver. On some radar warning receiver systems, mostly Soviet ones, the display is slightly different. Instead of just the radar ping, you also get a green shaded area around it on the circular scope. This shows you the specific sensor on your plane that's being lit up, rather than trying to estimate a direction for you. And the source of the radar ping could be anywhere within the angles of that particular sensor. Well, that was a lot of information, but that about wraps it up for now. A shameless plug for my complete guides to both air-to-air missiles and air-to-ground weapons, which are very synergistic with this radar guide, and links to both will be in the description and a pinned comment. If you found this guide useful, please consider subscribing to the channel and maybe checking out my other video playlists. As always, thanks for watching.